He fell asleep at his desk, and while he slept, 40,000 soldiers were saved. His name was Johan Nepomuk Natter. He was not a general, not a strategist, not a man whose name would ever appear in any dispatches or victory speeches. He was a cartographer, a civilian, a man who spent his life measuring distances between places other men would walk to and fight over and die in. And on the night of the 14th of July, 1866, he was alone in a room that smelled of ink and tallow and something older, the particular stillness of a place where the world's shape is decided on paper before anyone goes out to check whether the world agrees. The room was called the Kartenarchiv, the map archive. It sat in the eastern wing of the Imperial and Royal Military Geographic Institute in Vienna, a building that most Viennese citizens had never entered, and most soldiers had never heard of, and yet which had, over the previous 30 years, quietly become the most important room in the Austrian Empire. Because maps are not just pictures of places, maps are decisions. Every line a cartographer draws tells an army where to march. Every elevation marking tells a colonel whether to advance or retreat. Every road, every ford, every mountain pass marked on a military survey, those marks become flesh. They become orders. They become bodies. Johan Natter understood this better than almost anyone alive in 1866. He was 43 years old. He had been working at the Institute since he was 19. He had drawn and corrected and revised over 4,000 individual survey sheets in that time. He had never held a rifle. He had never stood on a battlefield. He had never heard the sound of an artillery shell cutting through morning air. But on this particular night, he was trying to undo something that would send men directly into the path of one. Let me take you into that room slowly. Let the city outside go quiet. The date is the 14th of July. The hour is somewhere past 2 in the morning. Vienna is restless. The whole empire is restless, because 6 days earlier, on the 8th of July, Austria had suffered one of the most catastrophic military defeats in its modern history, at the Battle of Königgrätz, at a place sometimes called Sadowa, a place where the Prussian needle gun met the Austrian infantry in open field, and where the results were so terrible that even the soldiers who survived would not speak of what they had seen for years afterward. 44,000 Austrian casualties in a single day. The war with Prussia, the 7 Weeks' War, they would later call it, with an almost breezy casualness, was effectively over before July even ended. But armies do not stop moving the moment a battle ends. Orders already issued travel forward at the speed of riders on horseback. Columns of infantry continue to march toward positions that were strategically important last week and are now simply fatal. And in the chaos of retreat, of regrouping, of broken communication lines, the maps keep being used. The maps from the archive. The maps that Natter and his colleagues had spent years producing. One of those maps had an error, not a small error, not the kind of error that means a road is half a kilometer shorter than indicated. This was a fundamental error, a ghost, a mountain that no longer existed on the map, or more precisely, a mountain that existed on the ground but had been erroneously omitted from the most recent corrected survey sheet, the one dated 1864, the one that had been distributed to field commanders in the Southern Theater in the days before the war began. The mountain's name was the Kleiner Steinriegel. It was not a dramatic peak. It was not the Alps. It was a ridge, a steep wooded ridge in the southern approach corridor between the Styrian highlands and the Slovenian border. A ridge that, in the older 1857 survey, appeared clearly marked with elevation contours, with the standard Hashur marks indicating steep eastern slope, with the notation that the eastern face was impassable to formed infantry. In the 1864 revision, it had simply vanished. Whether through a copying error, a misread of the original field notes, a moment of inattention at a drafting table, no one would ever know for certain. But the ridge was gone from the current operational maps, and somewhere to the south, a column of Austrian infantry, the precise number Natter had been told was approximately 40,000 men, was being redirected away from the Prussian advance through a southern corridor toward a march route that, according to the current map, was a wide open valley approach. According to the ground, it was a ridge with an eastern face that would funnel an army into a killing position. Johan Natter had discovered the error at 10:30 that evening. He had not discovered it through any act of heroism. He had been doing routine archive work, comparing the 1864 sheets against original field survey notebooks, part of a post-mobilization audit that the Institute director had ordered once the campaign began to ensure field copies matched archive originals. It was tedious work, the kind of work that made young cartographers consider other professions. Natter had been at it since 7 in the morning, 16 sheets verified, 3 minor discrepancies noted and flagged. His back ached, his eyes were burning. He had eaten nothing since midday. He opened sheet 47. The Kleiner Steinriegel. He looked at the 1864 sheet. He looked at the 1857 field notebook. He looked at the 1864 sheet again. He put both pages down. He stood up, walked to the window, and stood there for approximately 2 minutes looking at nothing. Then he walked back to the table, pulled out the field notebooks for 1856 and 1858 as well, and confirmed what he already knew with absolute certainty. The ridge was missing. He sat down, he wrote a note. He sent the night porter, a boy named Franz, 17 years old, asleep at the Institute entrance, to the home of the Institute director, Major Theodor von Haunold, with a message asking for immediate instructions. Franz came back 40 minutes later with the information that Major von Haunold was not at home. He was at a dinner, at the residence of a general whose name Franz had been given but could not quite reproduce accurately. He had left the note. He had been told that the major would receive it when he returned. Natter wrote a second note, more urgent. He listed the corridor, the missing ridge, the approximate position of the column as he understood it from the operational briefings he had attended the previous week. He estimated the march timeline. He sent Franz out again, this time to the military headquarters on the Ringstrasse. Franz came back in 50 minutes. The duty officer at headquarters had received the note. He had asked Franz a number of questions that Franz could not answer. He had said that someone would look into it. He had not seemed alarmed. This was now approximately midnight. Natter sat for a moment in the archive with the 2 maps in front of him. He was a cartographer, a civilian. He had no authority over troop movements. He had no direct communication with field commanders. He had done what he was supposed to do. He had reported up the chain. He had put the information in front of the people whose job it was to act on it. He could lock up the archive, go home, go to sleep. Whatever happened next was not his responsibility. He looked at the 1864 sheet, at the place where the ridge should have been, at the clean, unmarked valley that existed on paper and nowhere else. He unlocked the supply cabinet and took out a fresh sheet of copperplate paper. He took out the ruling pens and the compass and the hachure rake. He pulled the original 1857 field notebook into the center of the table and opened it to the Kleiner Steinriegel survey pages. He was going to redraw the section, not because anyone had asked him to, not because it was his place to decide whether an updated correction sheet would reach anyone in time, but because he was a man who had spent 24 years making the world accurate on paper, and inaccuracy on paper, in this room, in this profession, was not an abstraction. It was bodies. He began at midnight. The correction he needed to make was not enormous in terms of area, perhaps 10 centimeters by 8 centimeters on the sheet, but military topographic drafting at the scale the Institute used, 1 to 75,000, required extraordinary precision. Every hachure mark indicating slope had to be correctly spaced. Every elevation contour had to be fair curved with a steady hand. The impassable eastern face notation had to be rendered in the correct military symbology, in a specific ink weight, so that a field officer reading the sheet in bad light on the back of a horse would understand instantly what they were looking at. You could not rush this. At 1 in the morning, he had completed the ridge outline and the base contours. He was working faster than he normally would. His hand was good. It had always been good, steadier than most, but speed and precision were not natural companions in this work, and he knew he was taking risks with the ink density, with the curve fairness, with the hachure spacing. He allowed himself to think, briefly, about what was happening to the south of Vienna that night. The column, 40,000 men, would be moving, or would have stopped to camp, or would be receiving new orders as a result of the chaos following Königgrätz. He did not know. He was a cartographer in an archive room, and the distance between his table and the actual ground was not just geographic. But somewhere, an officer was holding a map that showed nothing where there was a mountain. And somewhere, a courier, he did not know this yet, but it was already true, was being saddled and given a dispatch case and told to ride. The Empire had not entirely stopped functioning. Natter's note to headquarters had, in fact, not simply disappeared into the bureaucratic dark. The duty officer had forwarded it. It had reached, at approximately 11:15 that night, a colonel named Bergmann. Heinrich Bergmann, chief of the operations section, who had read it, understood it immediately, and made the decision that the column had to be redirected before it reached the southern corridor approach. The problem was communication. In 1866, the Austrian military's telegraph network was partially functional, partially damaged by the campaign, and in the southern sector, effectively absent. The riders were the system. And Colonel Bergmann had ordered, at 11:40, that a courier be dispatched with a written order to the column commander, a lieutenant field marshal whose name does not appear in the surviving records, redirecting the march. That courier was already riding. He carried a written order. The order referred to the operational map, the current operational map, the 1864 sheet, and told the column commander to halt at a specific grid reference and await further instruction. The grid reference was expressed in terms of the 1864 map coordinates. The column commander would receive that order. He would look at his 1864 map. He would look at the grid reference, and the grid reference, by a secondary error introduced in the haste of the dispatch, corresponded to a point that was on the 1864 map in the absence of the ridge, an open position suitable for halting a column. On the ground, it was the eastern base of the Kleiner Steinriegel, the place where 40,000 men would be funneled against an impassable face with no room to form and no room to retreat. Natter did not know this. He knew there was an error on the map. He knew the column was moving. He knew the people he had told were doing something. He did not know what. He kept drawing. At 1:40 in the morning, he completed the hachure work on the western slope and began the eastern face notation. the impassable designation, the specific marks that told a soldier, "Do not bring your men here. Do not come this way. There is no way through." His candle had burned down by about a third. He had lit a second one, placed it to the left, so he had cross-lighting. Cartographers knew that a single light source could create shadows that made your own pen strokes invisible when you were working fine detail. He was very tired. He had been awake for approximately 19 hours at this point. He had eaten nothing since midday. The archive was cold. Vienna in July is not cold, but the Imperial and Royal Military Geographic Institute had thick stone walls, and the eastern wing caught no afternoon sun, and at 2 in the morning the cold came up through the stone floor and the wooden chair and into his bones. He thought briefly about making tea. The institute had a small stove in the porter's room near the entrance. Franz was presumably asleep there. He did not get up. He kept drawing. Let the room be quiet for a moment. Let the only sound be the scratch of the pen on the paper. The night outside is Vienna in summer, which means it is not entirely quiet. There are carriages, even at this hour. There are soldiers moving through the streets. The city is half militarized, half panicked, half trying to pretend that nothing is wrong and that the empire has not just lost 4 weeks of war in 4 hours at a place called Königgrätz. But in the archive room there is only the pen, only the map taking shape under Natter's hand. He was, by any reasonable measure, one of the best cartographers in Europe. He had won an award from the Geographic Society in 1859 for a series of surveys of the Carinthian Mountains. He had been invited to contribute to a comparative atlas of the Danube Basin. He had corresponded with cartographers in London and Paris and St. Petersburg, men who knew his name and respected his precision. He was also a person who had, at age 31, lost a son, a boy named Anton, 7 years old, scarlet fever, dead in 4 days. He had come back to work at the archive the week after the funeral because he did not know what else to do. Because the maps were still there, because the measurements still needed to be made, because the world still had a shape and someone needed to record it accurately. He had never spoken about Anton at the Institute. His colleagues knew, in the way that people in small professional worlds always know these things. But Natter was not a man who spoke of personal things. He spoke of distances, of elevations, of the correct rendering of impassable terrain. At 2:17 in the morning, he finished the eastern face of the Kleiner Steinriegel. He put down the hachur pen. He picked up a finer ruling pen for the annotation work. He leaned close to the paper and wrote in the small, precise lettering of a trained military cartographer, Kleiner Steinriegel, Osthang unpassierbar, eastern slope impassable, 6 words, on a piece of paper the size of a dinner plate, in a room that no one else was in a city that was trying to forget it had just lost a war. He sat back. He looked at what he had drawn. It was correct. He needed to let the ink dry. This was not optional. Military survey paper of that period was sized, coated to take ink without bleeding, but it still required drying time, particularly for annotations made in close quarters with high ink density. If he folded the sheet, or rolled it, or handed it to anyone before the ink was fully dry, he risked smearing. A smeared annotation on a military map was worse than no annotation. It suggested something was there without telling you what it was. The ink needed 40 minutes, minimum. He looked at the clock on the wall, a heavy brass-faced clock that had been in the archives since before he started working there, that kept exceptionally good time. It was 2:22. 40 minutes. It would be 3 in the morning. He sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling and thought, in the unfocused way of a very tired man, about whether what he had done was enough, about whether the duty officer at headquarters had acted on his note, about whether Colonel Bergman, he did not know Bergman's name, did not know anyone had specifically received his information, had issued any orders, about whether the courier system was working at all in the southern sector. He thought about Franz, asleep in the porter's room. He thought about whether there was anyone else he could send a message to. He thought about the column, 40,000 men. The number had been given to him during an operational briefing 2 weeks earlier, in a different context entirely. It was a figure mentioned in passing, describing the strength of the southern deployment. He had written it in the margin of his briefing notes. 40,000. He had never held a rifle. He sat in the chair and he waited for the ink to dry. He was asleep within 11 minutes. This is the part of the story that people sometimes find difficult to understand, that he simply fell asleep, that the man who had been awake for 19 hours, who had been working under extraordinary tension, who had just completed a piece of work of potentially enormous consequence, simply put his head back against the chair and closed his eyes and slept. But this is exactly what exhausted human beings do. They sleep. And while he slept, the candle on the right burned down past its holder and guttered. The one on the left continued burning, casting the room in softer shadow. The ink on the map dried. The clock on the wall marked 2:40, then 3, then 3:20. The courier, who had been riding since shortly before midnight, was by now approximately 80 kilometers south of Vienna, moving through the foothills in the direction of the column's last reported position. He carried the order with the incorrect grid reference. In Vienna, at headquarters, Colonel Bergman had finished drafting a second communication, a more comprehensive redirection order that included a corrected grid reference and the specific warning about the eastern approach corridor. He had it ready by 2 in the morning, but the telegraph to the southern sector was down, and the night had only so many riders. He had sent a second courier at 2:15, but this courier was carrying the comprehensive order, the one that actually addressed the error, that specifically warned about the approach corridor, that named the Kleiner Steinriegel and said, "Do not approach from the east." This courier was 45 minutes behind the first one. In the archive, Johan Natter slept. He dreamed, though he would not remember what he dreamed. Outside, a carriage passed on the street. A dog barked somewhere distant. The city breathed slowly in the summer dark. At 3:47, the archive door opened. Franz, the 17-year-old porter, stood in the doorway with a lamp. He had heard something, or thought he had heard something, or simply woken from an uncomfortable sleep in the porter's chair and made his way through the building on instinct, the way night porters do. He saw Natter asleep in the chair. He stood in the doorway for a moment, uncertain. Then he crossed the room quietly, set his lamp on the far end of the table, away from the map, away from the instruments, and stood looking at what Natter had drawn. Franz was 17. He could not read a military topographic map. He had no training in cartography, but he could see that something had been made here by the man asleep in the chair in the middle of the night. He could see the care in the pen work. He could see the annotations. He went back to his chair at the entrance. He did not wake Natter. At 4:11, Natter woke himself, the way the very tired wake, suddenly without knowing where they are for a moment, with the distinct sense that something important is unfinished. He looked at the map. He looked at the clock. He looked at the dried ink on the annotation. He touched the paper very gently with one fingertip. Testing. Dry. He stood up. His back made a noise. He rolled his shoulders. He picked up the completed correction sheet with both hands and walked to the door of the archive. "Franz," he said. Franz appeared from the shadows of the corridor, already awake, lamp in hand. "I need this to go to to the duty officer at headquarters. Right now. Immediately. Tell them this is the corrected survey sheet for the southern corridor. Tell them the annotation on the eastern approach is verified against the original 1857 field survey. Tell them..." He stopped. Tell them what? That he was a cartographer who had redrawn a section of a military map in the middle of the night because he could not sleep? Tell them that the correction needed to reach the column before the column reached the corridor? "Tell them it is urgent," he said. "Tell them the cartographer says it is urgent." Franz took the rolled sheet. He was gone. Natter went back into the archive and sat down at the drafting table and put his head in his hands and sat like that for a while. Not crying, not praying, just sitting in the particular silence of a man who has done everything he can do and has reached the edge of his own reach. He was 43 years old. He had been a cartographer for 24 years. He had redrawn a piece of terrain from memory and original field notes in the small hours of the morning, and he had sent it with a 17-year-old boy through sleeping streets toward a military headquarters where men he had never met would decide whether to act on it. The column was out there, somewhere in the dark south of the empire, moving or camped or confused, or receiving orders from riders who carried maps with errors and maps without errors, and written orders with incorrect grid references. There was nothing more Natter could do. He sat back in the chair. He looked at the ceiling. He closed his eyes. What happened next? Franz reached headquarters before dawn, and the corrected sheet was handed to Colonel Bergman within the hour. The second courier, carrying the comprehensive redirection order, overtook the first 40 kilometers south of Vienna and delivered the warning before the column entered the approach corridor. The 40,000 men were halted, rerouted west, and never reached the eastern face of the Kleiner Steinriegel.